all three. And to start with, we're going to hear from Judge Tana Lynn, and then from Tanya Culbertson, who's going to do the welcome from the M. Margaret McKeown Federal Bar Association. And then lastly, you'll hear from Katie O'Sullivan, who's on the board, fellow board member at the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. That's a mouthful. And we have folks joining us across the 9th Circuit online. And one of the reasons we got a little bit of a late start is we're just getting those folks virtually in the room with us. So I should introduce myself. I'm Cynthia Jones. I am the program chair of the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society, and it took me about 3 years to say that without pausing. And we're going to get started. So without further ado, let's hear the court welcome from Judge Tana Lynn. Judge Lynn, please.
Thanks, Cynthia. A warm welcome to the M3 FBA and the 9th Circuit Judicial, see, I didn't get that right. The 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. Thank you for holding the Women's History Month CLE here in the Western District of Washington Courthouse. And thanks to everyone who is attending this CLE for being here, joining together in this community, and taking the time to reflect and honor the women who have shaped our world and continue to inspire us and encourage new generations to dream big. Chief Judge Estudillo couldn't make it today. He's been hearing, but I know if he were, and I know you all know, he'd be telling some dad jokes, which I am not going to do. But I would like to start us off with a few quotes from a range of women over time, just to set the stage for why we're here today. So starting with somebody, a titan from our legal field, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She said, as women achieve power, the barriers will fall. As society sees what women can do, as women see what women can do, there will be more women out there doing things, and we'll all be better off for it. We always need something, I think, from the sports world as well. The success of every woman should be the inspiration to another. We should raise each other up. Make sure you're very courageous. Be strong, be extremely kind, and above all, be humble. This really is. And finally, to put this in the hippest of terms, a quote from Rihanna. There's something so special about a woman who dominates in a man's world. It takes a certain grace, strength, intelligence, fearlessness, and the nerve to never take no for an answer. And I think our featured speaker embodies this. So enjoy the program.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tanya Culbertson, and this year I am the treasurer of the M3 FBA, so I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the association. This CLE, which is just one of the many events that we help put on each year, is an opportunity for you to better get to know our new namesake, Judge McKeown. If you are interested in finding out about other events that the FBA puts on throughout the year, I encourage you to visit our website. That's fba-wdwash.org. And I also encourage you to sign up and become a member so that you will always receive notification of events like these. So thank you very much to both of our judges for being here, and we look forward to the program.
Thank you, and I'm Katie O'Sullivan. I'm on the board of the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. And if you want to check out our website, which is really outstanding, it's njchs.org. We have our still relatively new-ish executive director, Johanna Hartwig, there toward the back of the room. Welcome from California. And really, what does the Historical Society do? We do three things. We did that before we knew James Williams. But number one, we help put on programs like this one, often in collaboration with other organizations. Number two, we have a journal, the Journal of Western Legal History. It's now only available online, but it's really an outstanding journal, and a lot of work from the judges and others goes into it. So I encourage you to check that out, which is available on our website. And third, we produce oral history of the judges, often done by former clerks, people who know the judges really well. I know there's one of Judge McKeown. I should know if there's one of Judge Lasnik. Yes, of course there is. And so thank you all for coming, and I really look forward to learning some history here today.
Thank you all. So let's get the program started. A couple of housekeeping items, which Judge Lasnik said I'm not supposed to use housekeeping because he doesn't do housekeeping, but I'm using that term. If you want CLE credit for today, please make sure that you sign in the front of the registration table as you came off the elevator. And then we are hosting a reception, a wine and cheese reception that's catered by Lark Restaurant today. It's going to be in the jury assembly room. That was a little bit of a change from the courthouse lobby. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Judge Lasnik to make the introductions and get our program underway. Judge Lasnik.
Thank you. Why did we have to move? I'll tell you about that later. Why is the clock? Yeah, right. Why is the clock off by an hour? Well, there was an executive order this morning from the White House to do away with daylight savings time, so we had to move all our clocks back. Just making that up, but you can tell how crazy the world is. Some of you actually believe me. But the reason, look, at home, I do a lot of housekeeping. I'm the guy who does the vacuuming, I'm the guy who does the laundry. But when I'm wearing a robe on the bench and somebody at the end of plaintiff's case says, Judge, I have a couple of housekeeping matters to go over, that's when I say, please don't call them housekeeping matters. They're judicial motions or administration. And when I presided over the high school mock trial championship, I became known for don't say in front of Judge Lasnik anything about that. And then most recently, my new quirk is do not come into my courtroom with glasses on your head like Tanya has now. Wear them or put them on. I did this Coriendo, and she's like, oh, Judge Lasnik, are you serious? Yes, I was. But, look, we're not here to talk about my quirks. We're here to talk about my similarities with our honored guest, Margaret McKeown. And I'm going to start with those. We're both born in 1951. We both did not go to any Ivy League schools, unlike 98% of our law clerks who did. We were both nominated to the federal bench in 1998 by President Bill Clinton. In fact, Margaret McKeown was confirmed by the Senate exactly 27 years ago on this very date. That just about does it for our similarities. But we also grew up in towns that were not particularly fancy, very, very Republican, and never thought of ourselves as becoming federal judges. I grew up in Staten Island, New York. Before you may have seen Staten Island recently, we voted for William F. Buckley for mayor when he ran for mayor of New York City. We voted for Barry Goldwater for president when he ran for president. We were a haven for Southern spies in the Civil War, and we were a Tory outpost in the Revolutionary War. So when I say conservative, that's pretty conservative. Now, Casper, Wyoming, enough said about that. But
We weren't even a state during the revolution.
you're right, yeah. But it's such a great honor to be interviewing Judge McKeown. I didn't want to do this. You know, it's Women's History Month. Why not have a woman judge do it? I've already interviewed her for her fabulous book, Citizen Justice, about Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. But Cynthia assured me that I was Margaret's choice. So I have a lot to live up to here today. But my wife will tell you that I'm not daunted by many people. But Judge McKeown, I always rave about. Oh my God, Judge McKeown. I put her on this pedestal. genuflect and film the whole thing, and because she is amazing. So how do you get to introduce somebody who so many people better situated than an inferior federal district court judge has already raved about? Where do you go to find the right words? So,
You are in the meeting now.
okay.
Recording in progress.
So I went back a few years to say like 226 years to take what was said at the eulogy for George Washington, first president of the United States. And Congress asked his friend, General Henry Lighthorse Lee, to write George Washington's eulogy. And he wrote that very famous phrase, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Now, it turns out that General Lighthorse Lee's son was Robert E. Lee. And that's another story for another day. But this one, General Lee and his great friend George Washington were colleagues in the military in Virginia, as running farms in Virginia. And he wrote that great piece. And I love that because Judge McKeown was first in war at Perkins Coie when she was a trial lawyer and an appellate lawyer, and first in war in overcoming the glass ceiling and the barriers that all women faced when she came out of law school in 1975. First in peace, as a judge, I consider that the peace era. She's a fabulous appellate judge, respected by all her colleagues, respected by the district judges, respected by the Supreme Court justices, definitely somebody who is first in her profession. And first in hearts of her countrymen. I'm not just talking about her fraternity, sorority of federal judges or attorneys. I'm talking not just about the citizens of the United States or the Ninth Circuit. I'm talking about the citizens of the world. Because this is a woman who fights for fairness and justice throughout the world. And so she is, in my regard, equal of the father of our country, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of her country. So, thank you.
Thank you.
This is a eulogy that I'm giving here. And you can call me Judge Robert Lightsaber last night if you want. But when did you realize, Margaret, that you could be a lawyer, a judge, what you've become? When did that dawn on you back in Casper, Wyoming days?
Well, first let me thank you for agreeing to do the interview. We have a couple of other characteristics, I would say, is that we both practiced law here in Seattle for our careers before we went on the bench. And so the nice thing about Seattle is the legal community. And I think the relations that you build up in the legal community. So I knew Robert Lightsaber Lasnik before he put judge in front of his name. So I like to think of him as Bob. And so, you know, we were both there, and of course we had our confirmation nomination. The point is, I was actually not nominated before that, and I hung for 3.5 years in my confirmation process, which was no fun at all. But I will say that one of the best parts of coming on to the Court of Appeals is dealing with the district court. And I was so proud to practice in the Western District of Washington. I felt we had a really great bench. You know, there were a few oddities. We had some characters on the bench. You never 100% knew what might happen when you went into federal court. an opposing counsel came out of the judge's chamber, for example, before you, or someone says, "Are you a lawyer?" But by and large, practicing in the Western District of Washington was a real joy, and I practiced around the country. And every time I went to some unnamed districts, I just reminded myself what a great district this was to practice in. Well, I grew up in Wyoming, and of course, I didn't sit around thinking about being a lawyer. I'm really a math and science nerd, and I wanted to be a doctor. So I was accepted to Cornell Medical School out of high school in a program where I would become a doctor in 6 years. I'd go to Cornell for 3 years, and then I would go down to New York City and finish up my medical training. And I'd worked in the hospital as a candy striper, and I love babies. I thought I would be a pediatrician. And so I got accepted, and I got some scholarship, but my father said, we can't afford that, even with the scholarship. And the University of Wyoming was good enough for your sister, it's good enough for you. So as a kid, you don't really need to know what your family finances were. Apparently they weren't great. So I went to the University of Wyoming where I made money because they gave me so many scholarships. And I saved up that money. And ultimately, I went to Washington, D.C. One summer because I'd been there. I also was very active in Girl Scouts, like the hike camp, mountain climb. So I went to Washington as a Girl Scout, and I was introduced to Senator Cliff Hansen from Wyoming. And he took me to the Senate dining room, very fancy. We had hot fudge sundaes. And I was just so impressed. And so I said, "Oh, well, how can I work here?" And he said, "Well, you have to be in college." So day one in college, I write a note. I'm in college. I like to work there. No answer, no answer. So I write again. I'm still in college. I like to work there. And so finally he hired me. And I went to work in the U.S. Senate as an intern. And I was so captivated, particularly by the procedure in the Senate, that I decided, forget medical school, I'm going to law school. And I have to say, I worked with Senator Hansen for a couple summers. And then my last year of college, he employed me full-time while I went to college as kind of an assistant to deal with constituent matters. And that really launched a lot of my law school funding. But I realized, although he was not a lawyer, that this law business was pretty interesting. And I thought it was the kind of thing where I, like medicine, you'd be working with people and you could change people's lives. So that's how I ended up. And I would say one other thing. My mother, our parents were not college graduates. My father got kicked out of 7th grade, actually. So I would say he wasn't a real scholar, perhaps. But my mother always said, you can do whatever you want to do. And that sticks in your head as a kid. It's important.
And you read a lot of books when you were a kid.
I did.
Just like she did.
Yeah. I read every book in the Natrona County Library, literally. After I read all the children's books, I went upstairs, and a lot of them I didn't understand completely. But so I really spent my Saturdays at the Natrona County Library, whereupon afterwards I went to Woolworth's and had a cream soda.
So I didn't remember Senator Cliff Hansen, but you speak of him as the kind of United States Senator we wish we had now, a bipartisan person, a person who reached across the aisle, treated people with dignity and respect. Did you see that in your time in Washington, D.C. and with other senators too?
Yeah, it was a very different time in the 70s and even into the 80s. There was a lot of bipartisan talk, and virtually every member of Congress lived full-time in Washington. They did not commute on the weekends, that sort of thing. And when I was going through my confirmation process, Senator Hatch from Utah was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they had wanted me to come down and visit him. So I went down to visit him, and he said, "Just a minute." He goes to the shelf and he pulls out a Bible. And he said, "This is the Bible that Cliff Hansen gave me the day I was brought and sworn into the Senate." And I was like, "Whoa," And it turned out that Senator Hansen called him. Now, Senator Hansen told me that I was the only thing he agreed with President Clinton about. full stop, but that he wanted to make sure that I would be confirmed, so he called Senator Hatch, and Hatch said, you know, that meant so much more to me than any letters or any of this. The other person who called on my behalf was one of my partners, Bill Ruckelshaus. And I think it just underscored, Senator Hatch was from the old school, if you will, and he had a very great relationship with Senator Kennedy. And it just underscored how these personal relationships were important. They were important when they were log rolling and negotiating things, but there was a lot of legislation that was done. There was a lot of bipartisan legislation. So that kind of was a cue I took from my career from Senator Hansen. He was a real gentleman. It turned out, after I went there, they sent the girls downstairs to these robotypes, which were kind of pre-computers, and we typed out a lot of letters to constituents, like, dear so-and-so, Martha, that was Senator Hansen's wife, Martha and I were so pleased to read of your wedding, blah, blah, blah. I could type these in my sleep. Very sincerely yours, Clifford B. Hansen, United States Senate. So at one point, I said to the senator, I was thinking that I've been down here typing out these letters, which I'm happy to do, but what about a little policy memo upstairs, like some of the boys are doing? And he said, oh, I hadn't quite realized that. And I said, well, only the girls go downstairs, the boys stay upstairs. So then the boys went downstairs, which they're not too happy about. And I went upstairs, and I remember writing a memo for him on the supersonic transport. And it was being opposed on environmental grounds. And I would say that Senator Hansen was a complete environmentalist, to say the least, but he thought the arguments were good, and he voted against the supersonic transport, which was really kind of remarkable. But we had so many other times where he would look to see where he could negotiate with the other senators, because they wanted to pass legislation. So I learned a lot, as we often do. We talked about, Judge Lynn did, about rising people up. And I think that's so important. There's been a lot of talk about lean in, and I'm like an opponent of lean in, which to me sounds pretty selfish. I think it should be lean down and lift up. And I had that advantage from people like Senator Hansen, from some of the partners in my law firm, from some of the people I worked with on the National Girl Scouts. And so I think it's really important we think about that, because none of us would be where we are if it weren't for somebody else. And that somebody else might be a mother, be a father. For me, it was like a whole village of people.
Staying at the University of Wyoming for a minute, I want to ask you about black armbands and hours for women versus hours for men.
Yeah. Well, while I was a freshman, was the year that University of Wyoming played BYU, as they often did, and in football. And Wyoming had gone to the Sugar Bowl. It was actually a powerhouse in football. And a number of the Wyoming players decided to don black armbands in protest with respect to BYU's policies vis-a-vis African Americans. And University of Wyoming kicked them off the team. And you can imagine Wyoming barely won a game after that, because it kicked so many people off the team. And that black, I think it was a black 14, really became a stain on the University of Wyoming. But interesting, fast forward many years, the director of athletics at the University of Wyoming, who happens to be the brother of Dave Furman, who's here, who was one of my former partners. The director of athletics decided it was time for a reconciliation, and they brought back the athletes who had been kicked off the team. And there really was a forgiveness and a reconciliation, but that dominated so much of my freshman year, that discourse. Now, the other thing I learned as a freshman is that girls had hours and boys did not. Well, I experienced this in high school because as a high school student, I wore a uniform in a public high school. Did the men wear uniforms and boys? No. So when I brought that up, it didn't go over well. And I wanted to know, why do we wear uniforms? Well, they said it goes back to, the Depression and trying to equalize everyone. And I said, well, you could equalize the boys and the girls if we either all wore uniforms or not. So when I went to college, the next thing I encountered was only girls have curfews. What's the theory? Well, if the girls are home, then the boys will come home. What a stupid policy that was. So anyway, one of the very tiny things I worked on with the Associated Women's students was to say, let's put some equality in not only that, but some of the other restrictions, that we had. So I think for me, starting in high school and later, I started to really see that there were these tangible differences in how girls and boys, how women and men were treated. And then when I went to law school, there was no class or there was no book on sex discrimination. So I took a sex discrimination course and I needed something to write about. And one of the professors said, well, why don't you write to this lady, Ruth Ginsburg? She's a professor, and maybe she's got some material. So over the transom, dear Professor Ginsburg, help. You don't know me, I don't know you, but I need help. And she sent me some materials. And it was so gracious of her. And then fast forward years later to the Ninth Circuit as a lawyer rep and also as a judge, I became very close friends with Justice Ginsburg. And of course, she spent her life litigating these cases on women's rights. But to me, how amazing, and she was not famous at the time.
No movies about her?
No movies,
Books?
no books, no memes, but she had done some landmark cases in the Supreme Court, which we had read. And it was interesting. She would have wanted this interview to be by you also. But I learned really becoming close friends with her, she's incredibly shy. And so when I reached out to her at the Ninth Circuit conference, she would have, thought I'd shot her out of a can. Like, she's like, said, oh, hello. When you were Professor Ginsburg, I wrote you this note. And then, she warmed up and it just blossomed really into an amazing friendship that I could kind of cue back to that funny time when I was in law school trying to write this paper.
And you have had law clerks move on from you to Justice Ginsburg when she was on the court.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I have.
And you've had like 110 law clerks in your
Absolutely,
27
yes.
years. That's a lot of people. And I talked to a bunch of them. And, please tell me something negative about Judge McKeown. Does she pick her teeth or something? Isn't there a quirk there? No. I'm not saying they didn't know it, they just wouldn't tell me.
It sounded agreement, right? Well, so I heard that he interviewed all these people. Like, oh my God, because we spoke on Tuesday to talk about what should we talk about. And I said, so what are we going to talk about? And he said, well, I've interviewed like 10 of your clerks. I said, really? And then he didn't tell me. So here's my notes. I used to have more notes than this when I was going to say argue a case with the Ninth Circuit, but I have no notes because he wouldn't tell me what these unnamed clerks said.
Yeah, but I can tell you that it starts with Katie Sullivan and Catherine, who's Judge Zilley's law clerk still from the first year, and a San Francisco Court of Appeals judge who is from the first year. And there's just unanimous, that was one of the best years of my life and the best year in the law. But no great stories about other than, Judge McKeown will bake you a cake on your birthday. I'm like, oh, great, now, what am I supposed to do about that? But the humanity that they all talked about, that, she was a person who cared about me and my family, who obviously cared about her family, and, would always convey that kindness and sincerity is something that we don't see enough in the federal justice system. And that might be a segue for me to talk about your work on workplace environments. You know from having a colleague named, who shall remain nameless, except his name is Alex Kaczynski, that some judges were abusive to their law clerks, abusive to staff, and yet were allowed to thrive and advance and become chief judge, because that's done by formula, not by popular vote. What Chief Justice Roberts appointed you to look into the entire workplace thing, and within the Ninth Circuit, you set up a committee of law clerks to look at that. Tell me about that experience.
Sure. Well, I remember the situation quite well. I was in Seattle, I was shopping for Christmas. I got a tip from someone at the Wall Street Journal that there would be an expose. I called my chief judge, and what followed were a number of articles in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and otherwise. So at the time, the chief judge was Sidney Thomas, and he called me and he said, I want you to head up this committee. I want you to look at this workplace issue. And I said, I would do it if I could have just a very small and nimble committee. And he said yes, and he put no restrictions on what I would do or not do. And we were off and running because, we learned that even though we think we're quite accessible, and I think Judge Lasnik thinks the same thing, our law clerks have a little bit of fear of us. And we don't think of ourselves as people who would make people afraid, but they can be a little afraid, and we can be a little intimidating by virtue of our position. Some lawyers might say that too, and there's one thing like when you get to put on a robe and you get to sit up high, it can be intimidating. But we began to look at practices among judges, first in the Ninth Circuit, and we decided to do a number of innovative things. Well, first of all, we talked to lots of law clerks. I talked to individuals who had been victims of workplace issues. I spoke with the EEOC and other sources. And one of the things we came up with is like nobody likes to launch the big cannon, which is to file a judicial misconduct complaint against the judge. So we realized we needed some alternative avenues. It needs to be something less than shutting up or filing basically a misconduct complaint. So a couple of things we did is we started to look at graduated, where we first appointed in the Ninth Circuit the first director of workplace relations. And this is somebody who's not HR, who's not the judge, doesn't work in your chambers, that you can go to for some consultation. And it can be confidential. It could even be anonymous. We set up some anonymous tip hotlines. And it could be just an informal consultation. But if you needed to step it up, you could go into more of a mediation context. And then if that didn't work, of course, everyone is free to file a misconduct complaint. Just like you would be free to file a bar complaint for a violation of ethics. And so once we did that, then we started to have a law clerk advisory committee to work with us and to work, and it's a really active law clerk committee now. Several of them are career clerks, so they stay on from year to year, but others are term clerks for 1 year. Most judges have only 1 year clerks. And when I say the Ninth Circuit, I mean the big Ninth Circuit, all the district courts out to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, bankruptcy, magistrate judges. And we have in the Ninth Circuit around 6,000 employees, which is kind of amazing. And a lot of focus is on judges, but of course, we have a whole workplace. And so we have workplace issues with employees as well. In the federal system, we have somewhere north of 30,000 employees. So again, it's a big operation. And then after we've been kind of in operation for 6 months, and we've begun to make some changes, and we began to reach out to former clerks, to law schools, to say, you're the first line, you're training these lawyers, so you need to work with them. And then the Chief Justice appointed a workplace conduct group, working group, and I'm a member. I was pleased to be a member of that group, which I still am. And again, the Ninth Circuit was a leader in many of these things, and the nationally and other circuits have adopted many of the things that we've done. But you know, our work isn't really done. One thing we learned from the EOC, and any of you who do employment law, you know it's really hard for people to come forward with respect to someone of authority. So we're still working on that. We're working on the ability to report, the concern about retaliation. And, you know, we see in the federal courts a lot of Title VII cases, and in the state courts, of course, questioning law against discrimination cases. And we know that these cases are not easy to win. There's a lot of proof issues. So, you know, we understand the barriers from the EOC and others, and so we're continuing to work on that. And one thing that I love about being on the circuit court is I like having 2 colleagues to conference with. Now, you might not think that's such a good idea because he's totally in charge of his courtroom. But I personally like the give and take of the 3-judge panel, or in cases of a bank, you know, when you have 11 judges. But part of that is really consulting other people. And that's what we learned in the workplace, is that there's so much we don't know, but there's so much we want to know. In the Ninth Circuit, we've done exit interviews of our law clerks every year, and we've done employee surveys. And on a national level, the federal courts a year and a half, 2 years ago, launched a national workplace survey of everyone in the judiciary. So there's a lot to learn, and I think we're making some progress in that. But I think for all of us that are judges, we have to realize that when you put on that robe, you take on a different patina and veneer. And
I know
there's
you,
certainly one judge at least that says, don't call me judge, and then my last name. Not me. But, you know, the judges have quirks because we're
I think even for people, judges have more quirks than normal, but unless Judge Kuno is listening. But one of the things that bothers me is when judges are exposed for being offenders, they're allowed to retire or resign or go on inactive status, and then that ends everything. There's no follow-up. There's no, how did this go on for so long? What should have been done to stop this sooner? You know, I talked to Julie Robinson, who's a district judge in Kansas, who you testified next to in front of a congressional subcommittee.
very hostile congressional.
Very hostile, that really wanted to go further than the courts were ready to go in terms of policing the judiciary. Tell me about how that went.
Well, one of the things, the panel, I mean, I think it's one thing I certainly learned in Congress is that, you know, members of Congress have their own agenda, and it might not be the same one that you have. So when you're there testifying, you have in your head why you're there, or what you want to talk about. That's not what, you know, they want to testify, and they want to get their point across. But I think our goal was really to explain what the federal court was doing. And one of the things we did, and has been adopted now within the rules, is that we can have a look back. So after a situation occurs, we have the ability to kind of do a look back. Why did this occur? What could we have done differently? What we might do? One of the most prominent cases came about last year. No, this year. Last year,
Last
25.
Last
Yeah, last year with Judge Kindred in Alaska. And there were allegations of sexual harassment, and there were allegations even of improper sex following a law clerk's departure from the chambers. And ultimately, we did a full investigation. The Judicial Council recommended that that judge resign and be referred for impeachment. And both of those things occurred. The judge did resign, and the judge was referred for impeachment. Now, something like only 8 judges in the history of the judiciary have actually been impeached, and usually for things related to tax evasion, fraud, and some other things. But that referral was made by the U.S. Judicial Conference to Congress. And as we know, the service for basically life for good behavior is subject to impeachment, but it does have that proviso of good behavior. And so that judge, and there have been a few others referred for impeachment. Congress has not necessarily followed up on the referrals for impeachment, but that referral was made. Resignation, that's what you're worried about. Okay,
Well,
can I resign and get out of Dodge?
Yeah.
Okay, well, to begin, we have a kind of an odd salary system. We get our salary, and then when we, go senior or retire, that salary becomes our retirement. But to be eligible for that, you have to have served up to age 65 and 15 years of service, which gives you a number of 80. So any judge who resigns before that time, and that particular judge did resign, as have several others, do not get any retirement. And I don't mean they don't get pro rata retirement. They get secret.
That's a tough one, yeah. I talked about University of Wyoming, and Judge McKeown is one of the illustrious alums, right after Dick Cheney on the last list I looked at. But not the only one in the room who's on that list, and not the only one in the room who was on that list who went to Georgetown Law School, not the only one on that list who went to Georgetown Law School and then Perkins Coie. Say hi to Dave Berman back there. David, same track record. The pipeline existed for 2 of the illustrious people in this room. So you're talking about salary. You people out there do not appreciate this, but in 2014, Judge McKeown was the Federal Judges Association president and hired a Sussman Godfrey firm, which did it for free, to pursue a way for federal judges who had been denied pay increases for years to get a salary more commensurate with our positions. And we got it. And so every federal judge in the country owes a great thank you to Judge McKeown and the FJA for what they did in that area. Judge McKeown was also, of course, the first woman partner at Perkins, the first woman at Perkins to be on the executive committee, the first woman to be managing partner, the first president of the Washington Women Lawyers, the first woman to be president of the Federal Bar Association. Again, remember my theme, first in war, first in peace, first in everything. But Judge McKeown, yesterday we had a panel discussion over the noon hour where a number of women, Judge Peckman, Judge Fricke, some of the people on staff talked about, the problems they had as a woman, either as an attorney, as a judge, as a worker, You must have come across some of those in your career, and how have you handled those things?
Well, I certainly came across a lot of them. You know, with showing up at Perkins Coie and the guy asked me if I'm a Xerox operator. Now, I admit I kind of was Joan Baez-y type hair at the time, with bangs. No, I'm your new associate, welcome to the new world. But, you know, interestingly, I had a number of situations, both in federal court and state court, where the judges just couldn't quite believe that, for example, a woman lawyer was there representing the Boeing company or somebody else. And from time to time, they would ask, are you a lawyer? Or some other, or they would say, okay, we grant the motion for the plaintiff. And you might say, pardon me, but I would like to argue on behalf of whoever. The judge said, oh, really? Oh, okay. So there, I think the only way to handle those was, one, with a little bit of humor and humility, but not to be cowed by some of these comments, you know, that we got. We had from time to time to fend off a few handsy type clients, you know, but I also relied on my partners to help me out on that. I think also opposing counsel, and part of it is being young. I mean, every young attorney knows this, you look young. So then you add to that some other disqualifier like being female, and they think they can just roll over you. I do remember one time in Kittitas County when I went out there, and I wore a suit because I thought that's what we should wear to court. And the other lawyer says, Miss McKeown in her navy blue suit from Seattle. You know, it's like, okay, I've been condemned. But we won, and then I asked for the remedy. And the judge is like, well, you know, we don't really do that out here. Miss McKeown in the navy blue suit. So, you know, you just have to keep moving, I guess, because I think all of us have had these circumstances, male, female, young lawyer. Sometimes maybe they think now we're too old. But the reality is that, you know, through my career, I got thrown a number of, you know, curveballs. And I think that it was just important to stay calm. And when you can, use a little bit of humor. It's always a little risky in court, as we know. But I think the other thing that I endeavored to do was to be collegial to counsel. And I do remember one particularly difficult guy. He was difficult. So I thought, well, I'll bake some cookies. And I brought some cookies to the deposition, which also meant he was eating the cookies instead of yelling at me. But, you know, we became actually pretty cordial after that. But another time I made a birthday cake for the opposing counsel, and my client was incensed that I would be celebrating the birthday of the opposing counsel. And I said, look, it's long litigation. We need some favors. He needs some favors. Trust me, I have not caved in to the other side just because I baked him, you know, a cake. Another time I remember I was at a deposition, and the lawyer who was doing the examination of my client was incredibly aggressive. It was a female. So took one of those little yellow stickies and I wrote this note, where did you get those nice shoes? And I pass it over, you know, and like, you know, what could the lawyer do? Like, oh, you know, and it just like took the air out of the room and all this nastiness. So you just have to somehow break the cycle, break the bubble, that sort of thing. Had another lawyer who was Mr. Malaprop for sure. And in this particular deposition, we were in Hawaii. And it was also, I mean, a lot of these big cases, antitrust, you name it, there was a lot at stake. So the clients, they were invested in these cases, but this guy, we're looking out the window, we're in Maui, and he's looking at Lanai, and he said, "Is that island there uninhibited?" And so I was like, "Oh, well, no, not actually." But in that particular case, I made it a point to keep a running tally of all of his misstatements and misuse of words. We were in court in Chicago, and he was talking about redacting the documents, and the judge is like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "When you dedact the documents." So I have one more from my list, So anyway, but be that as it may, I just think, we've all faced obstacles. And,
That's a great story.
when we're in another example, we're in Hawaii, and we get to sit there occasionally, and we rotate, so it's not all that often. But we're having a drink the night before, and I hear this lawyer like saying, "I don't know how I'm going to get around, section 5." And they have some odd statute numbers, 504.3, whatever. My ears perk up. Hey, that's my case. And so I decided I better leave that bar. But, that lawyer isn't, one, thinking about confidentiality, and two, he certainly doesn't think I look like a judge. So we show up in court the next day, and I say to him, "Mr. So-and-so, how do you think you can get around section whatever the case was?" And he's like, "Whoa, you're talking to me." And then his eyes open. He's like, looks a little familiar to me, And I've heard lawyers on airplanes. I have on occasion, even as a judge, say, your client might not want that negotiation to be part of the United Airlines flight. And they were like, "Oh."
Well, we all know how awful men can be, but you raised the point that occasionally women can be really hard on
It's an equal
women.
opportunity world.
And when you went on the bench, did you have mentors who helped you? And did you have, you don't have to name them, but did you have other women judges who were like standoffish?
No, I was really lucky. First of all, Judge Fletcher from here was assigned to be my buddy judge. And so my delight. When I came to Seattle, there were virtually no women partners. Betty was maybe 20 years older than I was. And she somehow reached out to me. I was not in her law firm. Ultimately, she was on the selection panel for the White House Fellows when I was selected. So it was kind of this full circle when I became her colleague. And of course, she was very helpful. But I have to say, the few other women judges that there were at the time also were incredibly helpful to me. Judge Mary Schroeder, while I was going through my 3.5-year battle on confirmation, she would be calling me. "Oh, I'm in a phone booth in New York, but I just wanted to call and say, hang in there." And then next I'd know, "I'm in a phone booth on the airport," So I think that people were quite welcoming on the Ninth Circuit. We had and we still do have a buddy judge situation to work with the new judges to kind of, help them along. And I think the other thing that you have to remember is that once you go on the court, your vote is the same. It doesn't matter that you're a new judge. So we really have to instill in our newest judges that everybody is equal here in terms of their vote. But also, I think for new judges, you're so well prepared. And I think it was a lot easier, to be honest, to be a judge than it was a lawyer. And let me tell you why. I remember my first day on the bench, I probably could have recited the cases text-wise, verbatim. I was so prepared, I was so over-prepared. But I also realized I could just sit there and try to look smart. And I could say nothing. And no one would say, "Oh, she's not doing her job," because ultimately I'm going to write a decision. So as a judge, you would be hard pressed not to be able to think up a question about something. And so I realized, actually, this part is pretty easy. The hard part is if you can't make a decision. I've never had that problem. Now, I'm also willing to say I could be wrong, but I'm not going to sit on it for a year or two while I figure out if I'm right or wrong. So I think it's a fantastic job for people who love research, who love the law, who want to do something and make a contribution to society. It's a terrible job if you can't make a decision. This would not be a good job. On
I've
the other
always-
hand, maybe being a lawyer, it's not good to be a lawyer and not be able to make a decision
Yeah.
either.
But I've always wondered why some people want to be judges when they have such a hard time making a decision. But when I went on the Superior Court bench, there were definitely judges there who, the last one who shouted the loudest
Right.
would sometimes get the ruling because they were having such a hard time making a decision. But
I mean, that's the one thing you have to do. And, you go back. The other thing is that, you cannot beat yourself up every day if you think you've made a mistake. We, of course, do have the Supreme Court to review our decisions. And they, from time to time, say the Ninth Circuit has erred in something. And so we go back and we revisit it. I was fortunate. I had a pro bono case assigned to me out of the Western District of Washington when I was a lawyer. And it was the one time I did argue in the Supreme Court. And I lost in the district court. So I thought, well, I'm going to win in the circuit court. No, I lost in the circuit court. And I went to the Supreme Court and I won 9-0, penned by Justice Thomas. And then it was remanded. So we go back to the district court and I lose again. I'm thinking, didn't you learn anything? Then I went to the circuit court again and I was apparently about to lose again. And I'm thinking, not twice to the Supreme Court. But we then invoked the Ninth Circuit mediator. So I do want to give a shout out that our mediation system on appeal has been fantastic. And my particular, it was a civil rights case. My particular case did resolve itself in a confidential settlement. But, to say you don't beat yourself up doesn't mean you don't worry about every case that you're deciding. And so many cases that might seem like big cases, they have huge records. Sometimes those are easy. And sometimes it's those skinny briefs with funny little issues that have kind of fallen between the cracks that are the most difficult and hardest to piece together. And so you never know when you get a set of cases. It's going to be an easy case. It's just going to be a hard case.
my experience with the U.S. Supreme Court as a district judge was being affirmed by the Ninth Circuit and then reversed 9-0 by the U.S. Supreme Court. But the person arguing on my behalf was Dave Berman. So, man, I should have realized that.
Yeah, you really, let's just say you got the best deal in the Ninth Circuit. You got
Yeah, that was a 2-1, but it's a great story for those of you who are interested. Talk to Dave about the case because it was a very interesting case. Now, Judge McKeown, you have won so many awards and so many honors, and from Girl Scout Cool Woman Award to in American Inns of Court. And when you won that American Inns of Court Award, the Lewis Powell Award presented to you at the U.S. Supreme Court, I sent the link to one of my dear friends from Perkins Coie, who shall remain anonymous, except his name is Kevin Hamilton. And Kevin writes me back, it's just exhausting trying to keep up with her. Perhaps she could leave a few crumbs for us in the cheap seats every once in a while. Couldn't you just say, no, I don't really need another award, but here's a judge who might love one, or here's is there any possible chance you could say enough?
I have said enough sometimes, but I will say that I spent a lot of my time writing references for former law clerks, nominating them for awards, nominating lawyers I practiced with for awards, nominating judges for awards. So I do spend a lot of time nominating people, because every time I see something come up, I think, oh, I can think of somebody who should get the award or who should do this. But, the only reason you get more awards is because you're getting older.
Well, you're younger than I am, so I reject that I'm January of 51. She's September,
May.
May of 51. So, but this is a great profession where we can be in our almost mid 70s and still be Utes on our court, as they say in My Cousin Vinny, because we have Judge Bryan and Judge Zilli, who are both 90, and
We have Judge Wallace, who's 96.
appointed by Richard Nixon, and just a great person. I sat with Judge Wallace and Judge Bress a couple of years ago. Judge Bress is probably mid 40s, but he looks like 17. Judge Wallace was mid 90s, but he looks about 75. And I was kind of right in the middle there. And we went out and spoke to these high school kids later. And I asked them, how old do you think? Yeah. And they had Bress down around 25 and Wallace that way. But
well, Judge Wallace appointed the first gender bias task force. So that's appropriate for the Women's History Month. And he asked me to be on it, and I thought it was an honor. I was a lawyer practicing law here. And he appointed Judge Kuhnauer as the chair, and people said, oh my God, Fox in the Chicken House. Like, Judge Kuhnauer is chair of the Gender Bias Committee. He did a fantastic job. We were the first in the nation. It got adopted by the Ninth Circuit with no dispute at a big judicial conference. And then when I'm going through confirmation, one of the things they said in this hit memo against me is that I had been a member of this radical gender bias task force. And the funny thing about it is, of course, radical Judge Wallace appointed me. Radical Judge Kuhnauer was the chair, and Justice O'Connor wrote the introduction to our report. So, I mean, you never know. You're practicing law, and my feeling is, you shouldn't try to curate your career to be a federal judge, because the chances are kind of astronomical anyway. So you need to curate your career to enjoy yourself, do some good, practice good law, and you might take some cases that might irritate the powers that be, but you just don't know who those powers that be might be by the time you get old enough to be a federal judge. So I really loved pro bono program here at the Federal Bar Association. A lot of the other pro bono cases that I took, and several of them did get me in hot water when I went through confirmation. And, I had not anticipated that. But I don't think you can ever really know, what's going to get you in hot water. And my general feeling too was, if they didn't confirm me, I could always continue to be a lawyer, which I loved.
Yep. And you also have this portfolio of working in other countries, in international law, to try to teach about the rule of law and the need for independent judiciary and fairness in justice systems. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, that was really one of the surprises of going on the federal bench, is realizing how much interchange there was between US judges and lawyers in other countries. And early on, they asked me to go to China. I was like a first or second year judge. Well, I had worked a lot on intellectual property in China. And so I'd been to China a number of times. That's where I went mountain climbing, et cetera. And so that was really an eye opener, that we would have US judges in China. I recall going back to China, they asked me to talk about the death penalty. So I talked about the process that is given to individuals in death penalty cases, because they wanted to adopt some process. And then I went home and they executed 1,000 people the next day. So that, was a little dispiriting. But over time, I began to work with the American Bar Association, with Lawyers Without Borders, with the Justice Department and others, and really in a range of topics. Some of it relates to human trafficking, some to wildlife trafficking, some to ethics. I've written and drafted ethics codes for various countries around the world. And it's important to remember that we're not exporting the US system, but there are some values with respect to independence and ethics that are important. So, having been to a number of countries, and I work now on the board of the World Justice Project, which puts out the rule of law indices for a large number of countries. And we've learned that in the last decade, there's really a rule of law recession because worldwide, there's more authoritarianism. And as a result, it's not like have you put your finger on the scale of the judiciary. It's more like, boom, have you put your fist on the scale? So they fire the entire Supreme Court of Ecuador or Venezuela. They kick out the judges in Poland, on and on and on. I could go with these different countries. In other places, it's really restricting the internet, which restricts, of course, access to the judiciary. So I've worked on all these issues worldwide, and I've been very proud to be a United States judge doing that. But I also know that just because you have a democracy doesn't mean that you have rule of law. And you can look around the world and you can see examples of that. But I have to say, more recently, I was in New Zealand talking about this and talking about countries in Southeast Asia and in Asia, and saying that, we've had developments in our country that really make all of us think about the rule of law in the United States. And we can't just sit back and say, oh, we have this Constitution. It's been 200 years. We've endured with the Constitution. We really have to say, do we have the rule of law? And are there some cracks in that system? And if so, what are we doing about it? And I think it's important in the US system to recognize that judges have limited capability to reach out and talk about it. I can talk to you generally about the rule of law. Of course, I would never talk about any individual decision. And I'm 100% comfortable that we should be criticized and it should be part of the public discourse. I mean, we did not do this for a popularity contest, as Judge Lasnik will tell you. But on the other hand, what concerns me is that what we're seeing today, it's not a question of the court packing plan during Roosevelt, which got immediately quashed by Congress, but it's the tone of the rhetoric, and some things have changed. Social media has changed the discourse and the dialogue. So we now have judges being threatened with impeachment, having articles of impeachment filed, having their families outed on social media, having pizzas delivered to their houses unordered because why? Because it was a message of, we know who you are and where you live. So I think it's important that we realize that this independence of judiciary is not just something like that we throw around. It's a nice word, it's a nice phrase, but that it matters. It matters because, one, a lot of this discourse has increased the threats to judges. And talking to the marshals, working with the marshals, our threats are just going up geometrically. And then the second thing is, one thing we've prided ourselves on, I think, in the United States, is the compliance with court orders. Because why? Because the public has a confidence and trust in the judiciary. But if we start to lose that, then I think we've lost one of the bedrocks of what's really been part of our 200-year tradition. And of course, we rely on bar associations, on lawyers, on journalists, on members of the public to speak out when we can't. But also, I don't think we should remain silent when we're talking about attacks that really undermine fundamentally who we are and what we stand for in the judiciary.
Do you have any tips for the lawyers out there about what works and what doesn't work in oral arguments at the appellate court, both in person and online or over Zoom.
Well, we all are familiar with Zoom now, but how many of us, they go, you're muted, and you're looking around, so we got to all get better, me included on that. Well, first of all, in these video arguments, it is an argument, and you just have to pretend like you're in the courtroom. So I had one not long ago where we're having the argument, and the guy goes, oh, excuse me, and he get a book off. But it's like, come back. It's like you can't go research in the library, or you can't get on your computer or whatever. So you just have to treat it like it's a regular oral argument. We've had a few other funny things, some of which I'm not going to talk about, that occurred during oral argument. But when you come in person, of course, I think that is, for all of us, we've just finished a week of oral arguments up here for the Ninth Circuit. And I think all of the judges really appreciate the arguments. And anything I would say to you, you really know in your head already. You know that you should probably answer the question, as opposed to, that's a great question, but let me talk about what I'd like to talk about, Well, we'll get to that. And so the people who are great in oral argument, I think, have a conversation with us. They have only a handful of points that they're going to make. And you can ask them any question in the world. They will answer the question and then they circle back to their point, which is really effective way of doing it. The other thing that is often not done well is rebuttal. I have only 2 points in rebuttal. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, nobody has 2 points in rebuttal. And if you really don't have to, well, don't say it. But a few times I've seen these fantastic rebuttals that are just encapsulated of 1 or 2 points, because that's the last thing we're going to hear, is that little bit of rebuttal. And then I'll also say what Judge Owen said today, and what all of us have said when we're presiding judges: you don't have to use all your time. And if you don't see any questions, you can't necessarily divine what's going to happen, but you don't have to feel compelled to use all of your time. And I think the other thing that I am really impressed with is when a lawyer acknowledges a difficult case. It's either one, of course, they know we can't overrule a case as just a panel, but there might just be a case that they need to distinguish. They just got to put it right up front. Your honors, there is such and such a case. You may be thinking that is a barrier, an impediment to our argument, but let me explain why it's not. That's like, oh, now I'm listening. Now I'm listening because the lawyer has been incredibly candid and upfront. On the other hand, if they're like pretending like I don't know that case, or that it's going to go away somehow, well, that is not particularly effective. And the other thing that's great about the Ninth Circuit is that we are live stream on all of our arguments. So if you want to see how a particular judge reacts or interacts, you can go back and look at these arguments. It's a great training tool, I think, for students, for new lawyers, but even for any lawyer. We used to always try to sit in the courtroom, whether it was a superior court or elsewhere. What's that judge like? I remember going to Los Angeles one time 2 days early because I had heard about this wild judge down there that I should be careful of. Let me just say that judge is deceased, so you don't have to worry about him right now. But I went down there to see the wildness of the whole thing before it was my turn to get up there, And so I think it's really important to do a little research. We do tell you the panel a week in advance. As you know, there are circuits where that doesn't happen. Sometimes it's a day of proposition. I wouldn't even mind if it was 10 days. I think it gives the lawyers a little more time to think about it. I'll make just one last point, is if there are new cases or new information, just tell us in advance instead of springing on it at oral argument. I remember one of the very first times we started to use iPads, and this lawyer, Judge Clifton and myself, we decided we would try out using iPads on the bench, and we could put our briefs on there, we could put our information. So this lawyer starts talking about some new case. And it's, for us, it's actually faster to look it up on Google than it is on one of the search engines, just because of all the sign-in propositions. So we go on Google a case and we're looking, it's like, hey, Mr. So-and-so, you know, I'm reading that case now and it actually appears to say the opposite of what you imagined. But we now, you know, we've got full internet access on the bench. So we can look quickly at the cases already cited. We can look at things that you want to cite, but it's always a little better to have some, you know, don't ambush us. That's all.
So, Margaret, you're also a mom and a wife, and you've incorporated that in your practice and in your time on the bench. How have you juggled things to make that work?
I don't really believe in that term work-life balance, because it imagines this little scale up there. And I think Justice Ginsburg said it all, you know, you're going to have some of it some of the time and some of it other times, but you can't have all of it all of the time. So yeah, there are decisions to be made. When I went on the court, my son would have been in 4th grade. So still pretty young, needing to stay, you know, be at home. And even as practicing law, when I wasn't out traveling, you know, I would really try to be home every night for dinner because it brought some consistency. But when he was little, I traveled all over. You know, I have friends in a lot of places, so we would babysit and all of that. So I just kind of incorporated my family into my life. I didn't, like, for me, you know, make a dividing line. Some people work better if they make a firm dividing line, like I'm at home, I'm at work. That didn't really work for me. So I just incorporated it. You know, I remember going in with a little baby buggy to one of my first Ninth Circuit judicial conferences. And back then, you know, there weren't little kids at the conference, but I thought, why not? What a perfect place to bring a little kid. And so.
What about conference calls in the delivery room?
Well, I don't know about that.
Yes, you do.
Well, maybe. Did you talk to my husband? Well, some of you might not know that I commuted for about 18 years, or I should be more accurate. My husband commuted from here to the University of California, San Diego. He's a dean and also a political economist. And so he did most of the commuting, but I did some of the commuting as well. He did show up for the delivery room operation. And, you know, I mean, some people are hounding you to the end about do this, do that. And you think, okay, I'm doing that as best I can. But of course, if you have a really long delivery, it's pretty boring to just do nothing. So I listened to music, I made a few phone calls, whatever. But, you know, part of it is that I think my family was just part of my life, and my job has been part of my life. And I am a subscriber to the work hard, play hard system. And that is, I take vacations a lot. I like going places. We love to travel. We like, you know, my family loves to cook, eat, travel. And so, you know, we've done that consistently since the time I was a lawyer. And I remember asking my supervising partner day one, well, not quite day one, maybe 2 weeks in, how does, you know, vacation work? Because the truth is I wanted to go on a little climbing trip, short, but small. And he said, well, we don't really have vacation allocated. You just have to take it when you can. And I didn't know if I completely believed him, but I took him at his word. And so I started early on taking vacations whenever I needed or wanted, but it didn't mean that I wasn't available. And I had.
This is pre-cell phones, though.
Yeah, pre-cell phones. When you're on vacation, you're on vacation. But I also learned, I was taking piano lessons when I moved here, and I lived up by Cornish Music School, and I played the piano at a high school diploma in music. And so I wanted to take piano again, and 2 things happened. It seemed like every Thursday, the people I worked with would come in and dump stuff on my desk to be filed on Friday. And it took me a while to learn, well, Thursday is not a good day to take piano. The second thing is the piano teacher said to me one day, do you know that you play the piano like a lawyer? And I said, really? Did you know I am a lawyer? And he said, no, I had no idea you were a lawyer. But what do you mean by that? And he said, well, when you make a mistake, you know it, but you keep going. And he said, so I consider that to be like a lawyer. Whereas most people, when they make a mistake, they start all over again. I said, yeah, but if I started all over again for every mistake, I'd like never get past page one. So I got to just acknowledge my mistakes and keep going, because I like to continue on to, you know, sort of basically the second part of the sonata or whatever. So anyway, that was the things I did early on that I still do a lot is music, both playing just for myself and listening. Went to the Seattle Symphony last night with Johanna, and so that was really great. You have a new music director here. Last night was her first night of introduction. I guess she'll be back in the fall. But I do a lot of music. I still do a lot of hiking, tennis, etc. And anything I can do outdoors is a great day for me.
Now, the penultimate subject I want to bring up with you is there's a lot of people out there who want to know, how do I become a Judge Margaret McKeown law clerk? And I have determined that there is something you can do that doesn't necessarily guarantee it, but moves it forward. And I got this from Mark Middow here in the front row, and that is be in Sarah Alsdorf's third grade class in Madrona Elementary School. How many former law clerks came from that? Four?
Five.
Oh, 4 or 5.
So obviously,
Now, you have to stay for about 20 more years on the bench
I know,
for
well,
these
no, no,
people in
yeah, they're
third grade.
cycling through, and the teacher has retired, but some of you may remember Judge Alsdorf and his wife's wonderful wife and teacher. And I don't know how it happened, but you know, I've had a number of law clerks from Seattle, and I'm thrilled when they decide to come back to Seattle or anywhere within where I can fly quickly. A lot of them went to DC, New York, etc. But through some weird coincidence, these 5 clerks all were in elementary school with Mrs. Alsdorf as their teacher. So I would say it's nothing I did, but it must have been something she did to really launch these kids on this path. And most of them graduated from elementary school, went to all different kind of middle schools and high schools, and all kind of different law schools.
Yeah.
And then they converged back. And I will say that Judge Alsdorf was one of my climbing partners as well. And so we spent many a happy day on the glaciated peaks in Washington.
And that's the last topic. You mentioned travel, also rock climbing and mountain climbing, and you've been in some avalanches and scary things, but you believe in the outdoors, don't you?
I do. I do.
How does that help recharge your batteries and keep you going?
Well, you know, for me, there is no substitute for just going out into the woods, out into the wilderness. And it's possible there to not think about the law, to not think about politics, to not think about anything but the beautiful environment. So sometimes it's just a little walk, and sometimes it might be a more major hike. I don't mountain climb anymore. I've basically hung up my ice axe and my crampons. But there is just something kind of reinvigorating to me to be out in the wilderness. And as Judge Lasnik mentioned, I wrote a book on Justice Douglas, who for many people in Washington State was an icon. And of course, he was a big hiker and climber and environmentalist. And at one point I thought about reconstructing and doing all the hikes that he had done. And then I realized I probably couldn't do that in my lifetime. So I've kind of scaled back my ambition. And the other thing is that whenever I go somewhere where I'm going to travel, I always take a look at, is there a hike? Is there a walk? Is there something special, a way to get outdoors? And I should say my husband would not be characterized as an outdoor person. He might say like camping at the Holiday Inn might be for him, but not a tent, for example, or the ground or anything like that. But despite that, we've been married for 40 happy years, and I still
We're very
don't
glad
mind.
you didn't copy Justice Douglas in that department.
No, he
let
had
me tell you.
four wives. I've only had one husband. And I'll end on that note because I was in that trial during the time I was about to get married, and the trial kept going. And I said to the judge, I can't come tomorrow, Saturday, I'm getting married. And the judge says to me, is this your first marriage, Miss McKeown? So I kind of treasure that piece of the transcript in my wedding book.
But that was a woman judge, wasn't it?
It was.
Okay, just wanted to clear that. That one wasn't a guy that
And
did it.
don't think those district courts don't focus on the facts. He's always looking at the facts.
But it's so great, Margaret, to hear about your life. And I still have you on a pedestal. I can't help
Get outta
it,
here.
but it's great to talk to you.
It's nice to be here.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all for coming. I just want to make a quick announcement. Johanna has asked me to say, for those of you online, we hope to have a full recording available to you. We know there's a lot of folks across the Ninth Circuit that tuned in, and we had a little bit of a delayed start in the beginning. And then I've been asked by our M3 FBA to just give a shout out to our pro bono program. There's a flyer on your way out that has all the details for that. And I hope you'll all join us in the jury assembly room on the first floor to have a little conversation and continue this in a wine and cheese reception. So thank you all for coming.
Will the doors be open to the jury assembly?
Yeah,
room?
Emily
Okay.
Nero assured me that they're open, and
Go
they'll be
towards
assigned
the
to
William
get you
L.
through.
Dwyer jury room and then back there. Great.
Thank you, Judge Osling.
Great.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Margaret. We were adjourned.
We are adjourned.
Excellent.